Dr. Lionel Whitfield had tended the Voss household for 25 years, had set bones and stitched cuts and signed more death certificates than any physician ought to in one lifetime, and in all that time he had never once seen Adrian Voss's hands shake. Not the morning the cargo terminal burned. Not the afternoon the Calverton lawyers came calling with a folder of threats dressed up as paperwork. Adrian Voss was a still man, a quiet man, the kind whose silence emptied boardrooms and sent grown men reaching for their coats before he'd said a word. But on the morning Walter Doyle came home in a coffin of varnished oak, Whitfield watched those hands tremble at the clasp, and did not look away, because some things a man should not have to bear alone. Doyle had served the family for 22 years, driver first, then the quiet shadow at Adrian's shoulder in every room that mattered, the men who checked the locks and read the weather in a stranger's face before anyone else in the house had noticed there was weather to read. He was not a man who talked about himself, and Adrian had never once pressed him to. Whitfield remembered, years back, a winter when half the dock workers walked off in protest and stood in the cold without coats, and how Doyle had quietly sent his own car around twice that night with thermoses and wool blankets and never once let it be known whose order it was. That was the whole of what anyone in that house knew of his heart, small, sideways kindnesses, given and never claimed, the same way another man might keep a private faith he never brought up at the table. He had no wife that anyone knew of, no children, no family who came forward when the telegram went out. He had simply collapsed 3 states away, in a rented room above a hardware store, his heart giving out quiet as a held breath, alone in a town none of them had ever once heard him mention, on an errand so ordinary no one had thought to ask twice about it. The wake filled the front hall with men who had spent 30 years being afraid of Adrian Voss and stood there now with their hats in their hands, awkward in their grief, because the one thing none of them had ever learned to do in his presence was mourn out loud. Whitfield watched Adrian receive each one of them with a steadiness that fooled every man in the room but him. It fell to Whitfield to prepare Doyle for the viewing, and it was Whitfield's hands that found, folded into the breast pocket of his good coat, a photograph gone soft as cloth from 20 years of being carried. A young woman behind a diner counter, an apron knotted at her waist, laughing at something out of frame, sunlight coming sideways through a window with a flour sack curtain. On the back, in pencil so faded Whitfield had to tilt it to the lamp, 2 words and a month, Harlow Creek. June. He brought it to Adrian in the study that night, because he did not know what else to do with a dead man's only treasure. Adrian turned it over twice. 20 years, he said, and he never told a soul. Maybe there was no one to tell. There was me. Adrian set the photograph on the desk and did not touch it again for a long moment. Whitfield had stood in that study during wars fought with paperwork instead of fists, had watched Adrian Voss take grown men apart with nothing but patience and a closed door, and he had never once seen him look as undone as he looked now, over a stranger's photograph in a dead man's coat. "I'm going to find her," Adrian said. "For what reason?" "Because he carried her for 20 years and I never once asked him why. It's the least I can do for him now." He went alone, which was unlike him, and told no one in Harlow Creek who he was. The town was 3 states and a half days' drive from anything Adrian Voss usually concerned himself with, a crossroads, a feed store, a diner with a hand-painted sign that read Callaway's, the paint gone the soft gray of an old barn door. He took a stool at the counter on a Tuesday morning and ordered coffee from a woman with silver coming into her braid and flour dusted along her forearms, and he watched her work the better part of an hour before he said a single word more than he had to. She was kind to everyone who came through that door, and not in the practiced way of people paid to be kind. When a boy came in without enough change for breakfast, sliding 3 quarters across the counter like a confession, she took the coins, made change he hadn't asked for, and set a full plate in front of him besides eggs, bacon, a biscuit split and buttered, without comment, without so much as a flicker that suggested this was anything but ordinary. When an elderly woman 2 booths down quietly mentioned her check from the county hadn't come yet this month, May waved off the worry before it was even finished and brought her the usual anyway, and later, when Adrian paid his own bill, he noticed the woman's ticket simply wasn't on the spindle at all. When he tried to thank May for his coffee, she only said, "Eat it before it's cold," and moved down the counter like the matter was already settled. Adrian sat with that a long while. Near noon a man came in wearing a suit too sharp for the room, carrying a folder he set on the counter the way a man sets down a verdict. Russell Pruitt, Adrian learned the name later, ran the only bank for 40 miles and, it seemed, had been buying up the crossroads one foreclosure at a time, smiling the whole way through it. He told May Callaway, pleasantly, that her late father's loan had come due faster than expected, on account of some adjustable clause she likely hadn't read too closely, and that the state was widening the highway through here within the year, and a woman would be a fool not to sell now, before the bank had no choice but to take the place for nothing at all. When she didn't answer fast enough for his liking, he added, almost gently, that the county could always be persuaded to look harder at back taxes too, if it came to that, the kind of threat dressed up so politely it took a moment to recognize as one. "This diner isn't for sale," May said. "It will be," Pruitt said, one way or another, and left the folder on the counter as though it were a gift. She didn't open it. She refilled Adrian's coffee instead, and her hand was steady doing it, and that steadiness told him more about her than the kindness already had. He came back the next morning, and the one after that. On the third day, an old man 2 stools down, a regular, by the easy way the room treated him, mentioned offhand that May had been feeding strays at that counter since she was a girl behind her father's register, said there'd been a fellow once, years back, some drifter passing through with nowhere to sleep, and she'd let him take the back booth till morning and never once asked his name, because, she'd said to him one time, a man's hard luck wasn't anybody's business but his own kindness toward it. Whatever became of him? Adrian asked, careful to keep his voice level. Couldn't tell you. May never could either, far as I know. Wasn't her way to ask for more than a man wanted to give. Adrian set down his cup very carefully, the way, Whitfield imagined later, a man sets down something he is afraid of breaking by holding it too hard. That evening, after the supper rush had cleared, he told her who he was, and why he had come, and laid the photograph on the counter between them the way Whitfield had laid it on his desk, gently, like a confession of his own. May looked at it a long moment, and something in her face moved that hadn't moved at Pruitt's folder, or the highway notice, or any threat the bank had sent her way that whole long year. "I never knew his name," she said quietly. "He never gave it, and I never asked twice for what a man wasn't ready to give once. I just couldn't see him go hungry and cold and not do something about it. Didn't think it was worth remembering after." He remembered, Adrian said. 20 years. He carried you in his coat like a man carries the one thing he's got left to believe in. She didn't cry, not then, but she set her hand flat on the counter beside the photograph, the way a person steadies themselves against something. Adrian drove home the next day, and told Whitfield the whole of it in fewer words than the story deserved, the way he told most things. Whitfield asked him, carefully, what he meant to do now. "What he should have let me do 20 years ago," Adrian said. "Pay the debt properly, this time." "And the rest of it?" Whitfield asked. "The woman herself." Adrian was quiet long enough that Whitfield thought he wouldn't answer at all. "I don't know yet," he said finally. "I only know I haven't stopped thinking about a stranger's kindness since the day I found out it existed. That seems worth more attention than I've given most things in my life." His lawyers went through Pruitt's paperwork inside a week and found exactly what they expected to find, a forged adjustment to the loan's terms, backdated, the particular kind of fraud that ends a banking license without needing to end anything else. There was no threat in it, no violence, no need for either, only 3 signatures that didn't match and a state commission that took fraud against a widow's diner very seriously once someone with the right kind of patience finally made them look closely. Pruitt lost the bank by spring. The highway, it turned out, was going nowhere near Harlow Creek. He had invented that too, to hurry her into selling cheap before anyone thought to check. Callaway's stayed open. Adrian settled the loan himself, quietly, through people who never once used his name, because some debts a man pays without needing to be thanked for them. When he drove back to tell her it was done, May set down her dish towel and studied him a moment before she spoke. "You didn't have to come back to tell me that yourself," she said. "No," he agreed. "I wanted to." He kept coming back. Not every week, not at first, but often enough that the regulars stopped looking up when the door opened, often enough that May started keeping the end stool clear before he ever thought to ask for it, the way she might once have kept a back booth clear for a stranger with nowhere else to go. One snowbound morning, with half her help stranded on the county road, he tied on an apron without being asked and worked the griddle until the rush passed, badly at first, then less badly, while she laughed at him in a way no one in 3 counties would have dared. Whitfield watched him change, over the better part of a year, in ways 25 years of careful medicine had never once managed. He heard him laugh, actually laugh, at something small, the way men laugh who have forgotten they remember how. And when Whitfield finally asked him outright what it was about her, Adrian was quiet a long while, the way he got before he said something true. "She never asked Walt for a name," he said at last, "and she never asked me for one either, not until I gave it freely. There isn't a man alive who's bought his way into my company at that price before. She did it for free, twice, 20 years apart, and never once thought it was anything but an ordinary Tuesday." He kept the photograph. Had it framed, in the end, and hung it not in his study where he kept the things he was proud of, but in the front hall, where every soul who entered that house would have to pass it on their way in, a young woman behind a counter, laughing at something out of frame, and beneath it, in his own hand, a small brass plate that read only, "She fed a stranger and asked for nothing." Twice. The day May finally came to see the house for herself, the staff who had spent decades flinching at the sound of Adrian Voss's footsteps watched him carry her coat to the closet himself, and watched him laugh again at the doorway like a much younger man, and understood, all at once and without a word said about it, exactly what had happened to him. Whitfield walked past that framed photograph most mornings on his way to see to the family's small ailments, and he had come, in his own quiet way, to think of it as the truest medicine in that whole grand house, proof, framed and hung where no one could miss it, that the coldest reputation in 3 counties had been built, all along, on a heart that had only ever been waiting for someone to feed it without once asking what it was worth.